In the bitter autumn of 1942, when the winds of the Volga carried the scent of fire and blood, the city of Stalingrad had already become a wasteland of shattered brick and smoke. The Germans had come believing they would conquer it in weeks, but what they found instead was a nightmare of resistance. Buildings were reduced to skeletons, and those skeletons hid ghosts, Soviet soldiers who refused to die. Among them was a man who had walked out of the mountains of the Urals, quiet, steady, with the calm eyes of a hunter. His name was Vasily Zaitsev. Before the war he had hunted wolves. Now he hunted men. The Germans called Stalingrad hell. For Zaitsev, it became his hunting ground. He crossed the Volga under artillery fire, the river glowing red with the reflection of burning oil. Around him, soldiers clutched their rifles, praying they would make it across before a shell found them. When he finally reached the other side, he found a city barely standing, every corner a trap, every shadow a potential enemy. Within his first few days, Zaitsev made his presence known. His rifle spoke 5 times in one afternoon, each shot claiming a German officer who thought himself safe. His comrades began to whisper his name. Some said he could see through smoke. Others swore he could sense fear. Word reached General Chukov, commander of the 62nd Army. He summoned the young sniper, looked him in the eyes and said, "We need more men like you." And so, among the ruins of a bombed-out school, Zaitsev began to train others. He taught them how to move without being seen, how to wait without breathing, how to kill without emotion. He said to them, "The German can shoot, but the German cannot wait." Soon there were many like him, men and women both, crawling through rubble, hiding in walls, making every street a death trap. The city became a sniper's paradise and a soldier's nightmare. The Germans, once confident and unstoppable, began to fear the silence. Each day, Zaitsev and his comrades watched through their scopes as the enemy moved like shadows. They didn't shoot recklessly. They waited for the moment that mattered. A commander pointing, a machine gunner exposed, a radio operator relaying orders. Every kill meant confusion, panic, hesitation. And in war, hesitation kills faster than bullets. The days grew colder. Snow fell on corpses and broken steel. The sound of rifles echoed through the ruins like whispers of death. Zaitsev recorded every kill in a small notebook, though he never counted them with pride. For him, each mark was just a step toward survival. At night, in the faint glow of campfires hidden beneath the ruins, he shared what little bread he had with the others. They laughed softly, telling stories of home, pretending the war might end tomorrow. They were young, yet their eyes were old. As Zaitsev's reputation grew, so did the Germans' desperation. They began to send their own sharpshooters, men trained to kill snipers. It became a ghostly duel, unseen and unending. One shot, one breath, one blink. Life or death decided in a heartbeat. Then came a rumor. The Germans had brought in a master sniper, an officer named Major Erwin Koenig from Berlin itself. He was said to be the best in the Reich, sent for one purpose, to hunt Zaitsev. No one knew if Koenig truly existed. Some believed he was real, others thought he was just a story to frighten the snipers. But it didn't matter. In war, stories have power. Zaitsev prepared for him as if the man were already watching through his scope. The city around them burned and froze at the same time. The wind carried the screams of the dying through empty buildings. Yet within that horror, Zaitsev felt strangely calm. He was not fighting for glory or revenge. He fought because his homeland stood behind him, because if Stalingrad fell, so would the hope of millions. And somewhere beyond the smoke and ruins, another rifle waited for him. 2 hunters, 2 minds, 1 city of ashes. The duel was coming. The Battle of Stalingrad had already devoured armies. Now it would witness a war between 2 invisible men. The snow had started falling again, soft and slow, covering the blackened ruins like a shroud. Each flake landed on the cold steel and broken bricks of Stalingrad, the city that no longer belonged to the living. Beneath that endless sky of smoke, Vasily Zaitsev sat motionless, his rifle resting on a broken window ledge. For hours he hadn't moved. He was waiting for a ghost. It began with whispers, soldiers talking of a German sniper, precise and patient, killing one Soviet marksman after another. His bullets struck like fate. Men would lift their heads for a second and they were gone. Within days, fear spread across the front lines. Zaitsev's disciples began dying. One each morning, one each evening. Whoever this enemy was, he was not ordinary. Then came the report from headquarters. The Germans had sent their best, Major Erwin Koenig, an instructor from the sniper school in Berlin. His mission was clear: eliminate Zaitsev, break Soviet morale. Zaitsev said nothing when he heard the name. He simply cleaned his rifle, adjusted his scope, and muttered, "Let him come." The duel began without warning. On the first day, one of Zaitsev's trainees, a young sniper named Morozov, spotted movement in the ruins of a factory across the square. He aimed, hesitated, and then fell, a single shot between his eyes. The echo rolled through the city like thunder. Zaitsev arrived minutes later and studied the scene. The shot had come from far, but not too far, perhaps 400 meters. The angle was perfect, the aim deliberate. It was no ordinary German. From that moment, Zaitsev understood, this was not just a contest of skill. It was a duel of minds. He and his spotter, Nikolai Kulikov, began to hunt carefully. They studied every reflection, every glint of glass. In Stalingrad, a scope could betray you faster than a mistake. A flash of sunlight meant death. So they waited, motionless, buried in rubble, blending with the city's gray skeleton. Hours turned into days. Both sides watched, unseen, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Zaitsev would sometimes feel the enemy's presence, that subtle pressure in the air when someone is watching you. His instincts screamed, "He's near." One morning, as the first light crept over the ruins, Zaitsev noticed something unusual, a piece of metal reflecting light from the factory floor. He told Kulikov, "He's playing with us." That's not him. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The reflection appeared again, then disappeared. Zaitsev decided to test him. He placed his helmet on a stick and slowly raised it above the wall. A shot cracked instantly, sending sparks flying. The bullet had hit exactly where a head would have been. Zaitsev smiled. "He's here," he whispered. "And he's good." Over the next 2 days, they turned that area into their hunting ground. Zaitsev crawled through dust and frozen mud, inch by inch, searching for the sniper's nest. Every move was life or death. His fingers were numb, his stomach empty, but his focus never wavered. The wind cut through the ruins like knives. Somewhere across the field, Koenig was watching too, waiting for the moment to strike. The German had studied Zaitsev's habits, his patience, his methods. He knew this Russian sniper had killed hundreds, and that made the duel personal. For Koenig, it was not only a mission, it was a matter of pride. By the third day, both men had turned the entire battlefield into a silent chessboard. Each step was a move, each breath a risk. Soldiers nearby stopped fighting to listen for the crack of a rifle. The entire front seemed to hold its breath. Then it happened. Late afternoon. The city was quiet except for the groan of distant artillery. Zaitsev saw a small helmet rise just above a broken wall, far away. He aimed, but something felt wrong, too deliberate, too slow. He didn't fire. Moments later, a faint flash caught his eye from another direction, a real sniper's scope. Koenig had set a decoy. Zaitsev's pulse quickened. He turned slightly, searching for the second flash. His scope swept over rubble, twisted metal, a fallen sign. And then he saw it, the glimmer of glass hidden beneath a sheet of corrugated iron. He whispered to Kulikov, "There." Kulikov nodded. "I'll distract him." Zaitsev waited. Kulikov raised a helmet above the wall, and instantly a shot tore through it. Zaitsev didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He calculated the line of fire, adjusted slightly, and then exhaled. His finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle roared once. Silence followed. The echo faded across the city. For a long time nothing moved. Zaitsev and Kulikov waited for hours, not daring to rise. As night fell, they crawled toward the spot. There, beneath the twisted metal, they found a body, the uniform of a German officer, the rifle still clutched in his frozen hands. Zaitsev stared at the lifeless eyes through the moonlight. Whether this man was truly Major Koenig or another skilled sniper, no one ever knew. The Germans denied his existence. The Soviets made him legend. But in that moment, Zaitsev understood something deeper. It wasn't about names or records. It was about survival, will, and the invisible war between two minds. He looked at the rifle one last time, then turned away. Snow began to fall again, slowly covering the scene, erasing everything as if the duel had never happened. Back at base, the men cheered when they heard the story. To them, Zaitsev was a hero. But he didn't celebrate. He simply sat in silence, cleaning his rifle, his eyes tired and distant. He had won, yes, but in Stalingrad, victory always came at a price. The next morning, he was back in the ruins, crawling through dust and smoke once more, searching for another target. Because in that city of ghosts, the hunt never truly ended. The city was dying, but it refused to fall. Smoke covered the ruins of Stalingrad like a storm that never ended. Buildings stood like broken teeth, jagged against a gray sky. Beneath them, the war had grown quiet, too quiet. No artillery, no shouting. Only the sound of wind and the faint crack of a rifle, somewhere far away. By late November 1942, the sniper war had become its own world inside the larger chaos. Dozens of Soviet marksmen now operated across the city, in basements, attics, behind piles of bricks. Their rifles were extensions of their bodies, their eyes trained to catch the smallest flicker of movement. The Germans had their own hunters, elite snipers, each trying to outthink and outweight the other. The front lines blurred. Sometimes the distance between life and death was the width of a wall. Zaitsev had become a legend by now. His name was whispered in the trenches like a prayer and a curse. But even he knew that legends didn't survive long here. His squad, the so-called sniper school, trained new recruits every week, and almost all of them died within days. The Germans learned fast. They studied Soviet tactics, set traps, used decoys, even sent children with helmets to bait a shot. The silence had turned the city into a nightmare. Soldiers started hearing things. Footsteps that weren't there, breathing in the dark, whispers that vanished. Some couldn't sleep at all. Others froze under the pressure, afraid to look through their scopes again. The sniper war wasn't about bullets anymore. It was about who could endure the waiting, the loneliness, the fear. At night, the moonlight would reveal strange shapes among the ruins, mannequins, helmets, mirrors, all placed by snipers to confuse the enemy. Each side copied the other's tricks until no one knew what was real anymore. In the factory district, a young woman named Ludmila took position atop a collapsed water tower. She was one of the few female snipers trained by the Soviets. Her calmness under pressure made her feared among the Germans. One night, after 20 hours without sleep, she spotted movement, a faint outline of a soldier carrying a rifle. She aimed carefully and fired. The figure fell. When she reached the body, she froze. It wasn't a German. It was one of her own, a scout who had lost his way in the dark. Ludmila sat there, her rifle trembling in her hands. The war had taken her sight in a different way. Now everything she saw felt like a target. Elsewhere, in a ruined apartment block, Sergeant Pavlov and his men held a building so shattered that it was nicknamed the House of Bones. A sniper was stationed in every window, and still the Germans kept coming. They fired through smoke, through walls, through shadows. The building turned into a graveyard, yet no one abandoned it. It became a symbol, proof that Stalingrad would not be surrendered. Zaitsev moved between these positions, teaching, guiding, sometimes comforting the young marksmen who had begun to lose their minds. He told them, "Don't think about numbers. Think about your next breath. That's the only way to survive here." But even he could feel the weight pressing down, the endless cold, the smell of gunpowder and death, the emptiness in the eyes of soldiers who had seen too much. One morning, as the sun rose weakly through the smoke, Zaitsev and his spotter crawled through rubble to reach a new nest near the Volga River. The air was so cold that their breath froze on their scarves. They stayed still for hours, watching, waiting. A German patrol appeared across the field, 5 men unaware they were being watched. Zaitsev whispered, "First one on the left." A shot cracked, then another. 2 fell instantly. The rest scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. When it was over, silence returned, thick, heavy like snow. That was the rhythm of life now. Wait, breathe, shoot, wait again. Days later, the Germans began to retaliate differently. Instead of sending snipers, they used artillery to flatten entire areas suspected of harboring Soviet marksmen. Dozens of sniper teams were buried alive under rubble. Still more took their place. One evening, Zaitsev found himself sharing a piece of frozen bread with a teenage sniper named Sasha. The boy looked too young to be at war. He asked quietly, "How many have you killed?" Zaitsev didn't answer. He stared into the fire and said instead, "It's not about killing. It's about keeping others alive." Sasha nodded, pretending to understand. 2 days later, he was gone, a sniper bullet through the heart while peeking from a window. Each death added to the silence. Each silence added to the legend. By December, Stalingrad was a city of ghosts. The Volga River was frozen solid, and bodies lay half-buried in snow. The snipers had become shadows, more myth than men. They hunted by instinct now, guided less by sight and more by feeling. The faint tremor of air when someone was watching, the sound of cloth brushing stone. Zaitsev wrote in his diary, "We no longer fight for ground. We fight for breath." The duel between Soviet and German marksmen had reached a point where no one could tell who was winning. For every German sniper killed, another would appear. For every Soviet lost, another student took his place. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was evolution under fire. And yet, amid the chaos, small moments of humanity still flickered. A wounded German sniper once crawled out into the open, crying for water. Zaitsev's comrade raised his rifle, but Zaitsev stopped him. He said softly, "He's already dead." They watched in silence as the man froze to death under the open sky. By the end of December, the sniper war had consumed everything: time, reason, mercy. The city was no longer Stalingrad, it was a labyrinth of eyes and crosshairs. Then came the rumor: the Red Army was preparing a counteroffensive. Reinforcements were on the way. For the first time in months, there was a spark of hope. Zaitsev stood on the rooftop of a burned building, the wind cutting across his face. He looked toward the western edge of the city, where faint artillery flashes lit the horizon. He thought of all those who had died: Ludmila, Sasha, Morozov, countless others. He raised his rifle one last time and whispered, "For them." Then he fired, one perfect shot that echoed across the frozen ruins, a reminder that even in hell, there were still men who refused to surrender. The first signs of change came with the wind. It carried a different sound, distant thunder that wasn't just shellfire. It was movement, the rhythm of something larger than all of them. The Red Army was coming. By early January 1943, Stalingrad was a graveyard wrapped in ice. The Germans were trapped, their supply lines cut, their morale broken. Yet they fought like men who refused to believe they were already dead. Inside those ruins, the snipers waited, listened, and watched as history began to shift. Vasily Zaitsev lay hidden inside a shattered building overlooking a square that had once been full of civilians. Now it was filled with the remains of tanks, smoke, and snow. He hadn't slept properly in days. The German positions across the street were silent, too silent. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like an approaching storm. Kulikov, his loyal spotter, whispered, "They're pulling back." Zaitsev shook his head. "No, they're waiting. So are we." For weeks, both armies had been frozen in a deadly stillness, but the Soviet counterattack had already begun beyond the city. Operation Uranus, the plan to encircle the German Sixth Army, was unfolding like a noose tightening around the enemy's neck. The snipers of Stalingrad had one task: to make sure no German escaped. Each dawn, as the light broke through the smoke, the sharp cracks of rifles echoed across the ruins. Soviet marksmen picked off fleeing soldiers, machine gunners, and officers. The Germans responded with blind fury, shelling entire blocks just to silence a single sniper. The duel between invisible men had turned into a massacre. Zaitsev's rifle was almost part of his body now. His hands, scarred and frostbitten, moved automatically, chambering, aiming, firing. Every shot had meaning. Every target was another piece of the collapsing German line. One day, as the snow fell heavier than ever, a Soviet officer arrived with orders. "Comrade Zaitsev," he said, "the Germans are surrounded. General Paulus is trapped. Command wants eyes on the Volga sector." Zaitsev nodded. He gathered his gear, said nothing, and moved out through the ruins. The closer he got to the Volga, the more surreal the city became. Entire neighborhoods were buried under snow and debris. Bodies frozen in the positions they had died, soldiers, civilians, even horses. The silence of death hung like fog. Then came the sound, engines faint but growing louder. Soviet T-34 tanks rolled through the streets for the first time in months, their red stars covered in soot. Soldiers followed behind, cheering, waving flags. Zaitsev watched them from a rooftop, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. For the first time he saw something other than despair in their faces. But victory was not yet certain. The trapped Germans fought back with desperation. Snipers hid in basements, firing through cracks in the walls. Machine guns tore through the advancing infantry. The Soviets pushed forward step by step, every street a battle, every building a fortress. Zaitsev found himself guiding a group of young snipers through the chaos. He taught them where to look, when to shoot, when to wait. But he also saw the fear in their eyes, the same fear he once felt months ago. At dusk, they took position inside a burned-out theater. The red velvet seats were covered in dust and ash. The grand chandelier lay shattered on the floor. Through the broken windows, they could see the German positions across the square. Zaitsev pointed toward a shadow moving behind a wall. "Patience," he whispered. "Let him think he's safe." The German soldier stepped into the open, a split second of exposure. The rifle cracked. He fell instantly. The others watched in silence. Zaitsev lowered his rifle. "This is the last winter for them," he said quietly. Outside, the battle grew louder. The Soviets had closed the encirclement completely. The Germans were out of food, out of ammunition, out of hope. Reports spread that General Paulus had received an order from Hitler himself: fight to the last man. But his men were already dying faster than orders could reach them. Days passed in a blur of smoke and snow. The city trembled under artillery fire, buildings collapsing one after another. Soviet soldiers advanced street by street, taking prisoners by the hundreds. Some Germans surrendered without a fight, others chose suicide. Zaitsev and his team moved cautiously, checking each ruin, each hole for hidden snipers. Sometimes they found rifles still clutched in frozen hands. Sometimes they found nothing but silence. One night, while resting near the river, Kulikov said softly, "It's almost over, Vasily. We'll finally leave this place." Zaitsev didn't respond. He stared into the fire, listening to the distant gunfire fading with each passing hour. "No," he finally said. "This place will never leave us." In those final days of January, the last pockets of German resistance collapsed. The Soviet flag rose above the city's ruins, fluttering weakly in the cold wind. The sound of gunfire grew distant, then stopped entirely. For the first time in 5 months, Stalingrad was silent, not the silence of fear, but of ending. Zaitsev stood on a rooftop, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and looked across what was left of the city. Smoke curled into the gray sky. The Volga stretched out below, frozen and vast. He remembered the faces: Sasha, Ludmila, Morozov, all the ones who had fallen without ever seeing this day. His chest ached with something deeper than pride, a hollow space where all the noise of war had once lived. When the message came that Paulus had surrendered, the soldiers around him erupted in cheers. Some cried, some laughed, some simply collapsed where they stood. Zaitsev just closed his eyes and whispered, "It's over." But deep down he knew the truth: no one who had lived through Stalingrad would ever be the same. In the days that followed, he walked through the ruins one last time. Snow covered everything now, softening the sharp edges of destruction. The ghosts of the city seemed to sleep beneath it. He found an old church with its roof gone, its walls blackened by smoke. He sat there for hours, listening to the wind whistle through the empty space where once there had been prayers. When he finally rose to leave, he didn't look back. The rifle on his shoulder wasn't just a weapon anymore, it was a memory, a witness to everything he had seen. The Red Army marched forward, deeper into Europe, chasing the war toward Berlin. But Stalingrad remained behind them, a scar, a monument, and a warning. And among the ruins, the legend of the snipers lived on, men and women who fought not for glory, but but for survival, who turned silence into strength, and who proved that even in the darkest winter, a single shot could change the course of history. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of Stalingrad lingered in the minds of those who survived. The snow lay thick over the ruins, softening the jagged edges of destruction, but it could not erase the memories. Every soldier, every sniper who had walked through those streets carried invisible scars that no winter could heal. Vasily Zaitsev walked among the ruins alone, his rifle now slung over his shoulder, its weight familiar and yet unbearably heavy. He passed buildings he had fought in, each one a ghost of past battles. Windows were shattered, walls were blackened with smoke, floors were littered with frozen bodies he would never forget. He touched a scorched brick and imagined the hands of his comrades gripping it one last time. The young snipers he had trained were gone, many never even having seen the sunrise after their first battle. Ludmila, brave and sharp-eyed, had been killed weeks before the German surrender. Sasha, barely 17, had been shot while peering through a ruined wall. Morozov, whose laughter had once filled the night, was gone. Zaitsev could remember their faces as if they were carved into his mind. Every victory was colored with loss, every bullet with grief. He entered a collapsed theater where he had once watched a German patrol fall under his team's precise fire. The chandelier was broken, the velvet seats gone, but the silence was more piercing than any artillery. Here he understood the cost of survival. Every kill, every act of patience that had saved his comrades, had demanded a part of his soul. Others tried to celebrate. The Red Army had claimed Stalingrad, and reports of Paula's surrender reached even the most distant posts. Medals were awarded, photographs taken, parades planned. Yet Zaitsev felt none of it. The streets were silent, but his heart was loud with memories he could not quiet. The city had been won, yes, but at a price measured in blood and broken bodies. Nightmares followed him everywhere. He saw faces in the shadows, imagined rifles aimed at him in the dark. The silence of the city mocked him, reminding him that death had lurked in every corner, and it had claimed so many. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it carried the images of lost friends, their eyes wide, their hands frozen. The snipers who survived gathered occasionally, but their conversations were muted. They did not speak of tactics, of kills, or of the glory they had earned. Instead, they spoke of emptiness, of hunger, of the fear that would never leave them. A shared understanding passed between them. They had become something else, hunters and ghosts, survivors of a hell that no one outside the city could comprehend. Zaitsev often found himself staring across the Volga, imagining the lives that had once flourished on the banks. Children who had played there, families who had lived in the factories, workers who had built the city. None of them remained. The river reflected the pale winter sun, and for a moment he saw the city as it had been, alive, bustling, full of warmth. Then he remembered, and the image shattered. Even with the Germans defeated, the snipers' war was not over. Every trigger pulled, every shot taken remained etched in memory. The skill that had saved lives had also taken them, and the line between heroism and guilt had blurred beyond recognition. For Zaitsev, each medal was a reminder of those who had no recognition, those who had fallen silently in the ruins. Months passed, but the city never healed. Rubble remained, buildings were never rebuilt, the stench of war lingered. Zaitsev and his comrades moved on, but their hearts stayed in Stalingrad. Even when letters came from home, even when news from the front told of new victories, they could not escape the echoes of their own actions. Sometimes he would close his eyes and hear the faint crack of a rifle. Sometimes he would imagine the face of a German officer, frozen in fear, and feel the weight of every life he had taken. Survival had come at the highest cost. He had been a hunter, a teacher, a legend, but he was also a witness, carrying the ghosts of Stalingrad wherever he went. And yet there was one truth he could not deny. The city had stood. The Red Army had survived. The German advance had been broken. History had been shaped in those frozen streets, by men and women who had turned patience, skill and courage into a weapon stronger than any tank or artillery. In the quiet moments, as snow fell gently over the ruins, Zaitsev would whisper the names of the fallen. It was his way of honoring them, of keeping their memory alive. The city had given him survival, but it had taken everything else. Stalingrad would remain a monument, not just to victory but to endurance, to sacrifice, to the human spirit tested beyond measure. And in that silence, the sniper's legacy would live on. A reminder that even in the darkest of winters, courage could shine, and even the smallest actions could alter the course of history. And among the ruins, the legend of the snipers lived on, men and women who fought not for glory, but for survival, who turned silence into strength, and who proved that even in the darkest winter, a single shot could change the course of history. Years passed and Stalingrad slowly began to heal, though its scars were never truly erased. Buildings were rebuilt, streets cleared, but the memories of those frozen winters remained, etched into the minds of the survivors. Vasily Zaitsev walked through the city years later, now a quieter man, carrying the weight of all he had seen. The children who once played among ruins were gone. The soldiers who had survived with him had scattered across the Soviet Union. Yet every street corner, every shattered wall, spoke of sacrifice and courage. The snipers who had once stalked shadows now faced a different kind of battle, one with their own minds. Many could not forget the faces of those they had killed or the friends they had lost. Sleep came reluctantly, nightmares were frequent visitors. Zaitsev, who had been a hunter, a teacher, and a legend, understood that survival had a price far higher than most could imagine. The medals and accolades meant little when weighed against the memories he could not erase. Stories of the snipers spread across the world. Children learned of Ludmila, the young woman who had fought fearlessly. Tales of courage, patience, and precision turned ordinary soldiers into legends. The war books spoke of Zaitsev's duels, of the hidden battles in the streets, of a quiet war within a greater war. Scholars and historians studied their tactics, journalists recounted their bravery, and the world came to understand that the invisible war of Stalingrad had been as decisive as the battles of tanks and artillery. Yet for those who had lived it, glory was complicated. Victory had been achieved, but the human cost was unbearable. Zaitsev knew that every story of heroism carried a shadow, of loss, of grief, and of souls broken by relentless fear and death. Even decades later, he felt it in quiet moments, when the wind whispered through trees or when a rifle report echoed from somewhere far away. He became a teacher once more, this time in peacetime, passing on his knowledge to new generations of marksmen and soldiers. He taught skill and strategy, yes, but also patience, responsibility, and the weight of every life touched by a bullet. He reminded them that war leaves scars not always visible and that courage without conscience is meaningless. In Stalingrad, monuments were erected. Plaques honored the fallen. Streets bore the names of heroes, and museums displayed relics of the war. Visitors walked among broken buildings and frozen statues, reading the stories of ordinary men and women who had done extraordinary things. But no plaque, no statue, no book could truly capture what it was to wait in silence for hours, to hold life and death in the steady hand of a sniper, to feel the city breathe with every heartbeat. Zaitsev's legacy, like that of his comrades, was not only in the victories won or the enemies felled. It was in the lesson that courage can endure when all else fails, that patience and precision can turn the tide of history, and that even in the darkest winters, the human spirit can leave a mark that lasts long after the guns are silent. By the time he walked along the Volga once more, the river was calm, its frozen surface reflecting the pale light of the morning sun. He paused and looked toward the ruins that had been his home, his battlefield, and his prison. He remembered faces, the young, the lost, the brave. He whispered their names softly, knowing that as long as he remembered them, their courage would continue to live. The city had survived. History had been made. And the snipers of Stalingrad, once ghosts among the rubble, had become immortal in legend, in memory, and in the enduring story of human resilience. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was a testament to survival, to sacrifice, and to the quiet warriors whose unseen battles had shaped the course of the world. And as long as the stories were told, Vasily Zaitsev and his comrades would never truly be gone.